May 17th, 1945, Husum Airfield, Germany. Captain Eric Brown stands before the fastest fighter aircraft ever built, the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, 624 miles per hour, a world speed record that defied physics itself. German ground crews watched the British test pilot with obvious fear in their eyes. They made him sign a disclaimer. They called it nicht ein Spielzeug, not a toy. The fuel tanks flanking his cockpit contained 120 gallons of T-Stoff. 317 gallons of C-Stoff sat directly behind his head. Chemicals so corrosive they could dissolve human flesh to bone in minutes. So volatile they exploded on contact. The Luftwaffe called it their wonder weapon, their salvation, the rocket fighter that would sweep Allied bombers from German skies. Brown had flown 486 different aircraft types, gliders to jets, biplanes to experimental rockets. He thought he understood what made aircraft dangerous. As he climbed into the cockpit of the world's most advanced fighter, he had no idea he was about to fly something that killed more of its own pilots than enemy aircrew. The gun camera footage from Lieutenant Robert Johnson's P-47 Thunderbolt told a story that defied comprehension. Frame by frame, the 16mm film captured something impossible, streaking past a formation of B-17 flying fortresses at 25,000 feet over Merseburg, Germany. July 28, 1944. The timestamp burned into the corner of each frame documented what would become aviation history's most shocking revelation. The small bat-like aircraft appeared in frame 17, a dark silhouette against the pale morning sky. By frame 23, it had disappeared beyond the camera's field of view. 6 frames, 1/4 of a second. In that impossibly brief moment, the unknown aircraft had covered more distance than the bombers traveled in 8 full seconds of flight. Johnson's combat report, filed 3 hours later at RAF Badisham, contained numbers that his intelligence officers initially refused to believe. The mystery aircraft's closing speed, 624 miles per hour. The B-17s were cruising at 180 miles per hour. The relative speed difference, 444 miles per hour, represented a performance gap that shattered every assumption about aerial warfare. The Fortress crews never had a chance to react. By the time gunners spotted the approaching fighter, it flashed past their formation and vanished into the distance below. The entire encounter lasted 2.5 seconds. No shots fired, no evasive maneuvers possible. Just the brief glimpse of technology that seemed to belong in science fiction, rather than over the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany. Intelligence analysts at 8th Air Force headquarters spent weeks studying the footage. They measured wing angles, estimated dimensions, calculated performance parameters. The aircraft appeared tailless, swept-winged, unlike anything in Allied recognition manuals. More disturbing were the implications of its speed. If the Germans possessed fighters capable of 600-mile-per-hour interceptions, the daylight bombing campaign over Europe faced extinction. Yet the mystery deepened with each subsequent encounter. On August 16th, gun cameras from the 357th Fighter Group captured similar footage over Leipzig. September 2nd brought more sightings near Merseburg. October 19th, Magdeburg. Each engagement followed an identical pattern: impossible approach, speeds, brief visual contact, no weapons fired, no Allied losses. The revolutionary German fighter seemed incapable of actually fighting. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, the 8th Air Force's leading ace, witnessed the phenomenon firsthand during a bomber escort mission on November 2nd. His flight of P-51 Mustangs was providing cover for a formation of B-24 Liberators when 12 of the mystery aircraft appeared at 30,000 feet. Gabreski watched in fascination as they dove toward the bomber stream with closing speeds that made conventional interception impossible. They came down like meteors. Gabreski reported, faster than anything I'd ever seen, but they couldn't slow down enough to engage properly. Most of them overshot the formation entirely. The few that managed firing passes were gone before our gunners could track them. 2 B-17s fell that day, marking the first confirmed kills by the mystery fighters. But the victory came at a devastating cost. 4 of the German aircraft were shot down by escorting P-51s, their revolutionary speed useless once their fuel was exhausted. The kill ratio, 2 Allied bombers for 4 German superfighters, suggested a weapon system that violated basic principles of combat effectiveness. The breakthrough came in May 1945 when advancing British forces overran Husum Airfield in northern Germany. Hidden beneath camouflaged hangars, they discovered the intact aircraft that had haunted Allied bomber crews for months. The Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, Germany's rocket-powered interceptor, the fastest operational fighter aircraft in history. Technical intelligence teams swarmed the facility, documenting everything from fuel systems to flight manuals. The performance specifications match perfectly with combat observations. Maximum speed of 624 miles per hour. Service ceiling of 39,690 feet. Rate of climb exceeding 11,000 feet per minute. On paper, the Comet represented the ultimate interceptor, capable of reaching operational altitude in under 3.5 minutes. But the captured documents revealed darker truths. Accident reports filled entire filing cabinets. Medical logs documented injuries unlike anything seen in conventional aviation. Pilot testimony described aircraft that killed their crews through mechanical failure more often than enemy action. The revolutionary fuel system that enabled such incredible performance, T-Stoff and C-Stoff, hypergolic chemicals that exploded on contact, had dissolved German pilots alive. Captain Eric Brown volunteered to test fly the captured Comet despite warnings from his superiors that the mission amounted to suicide. The Royal Navy's chief test pilot had already flown more aircraft types than any pilot in history. But the Me-163 presented challenges unlike any previous assignment. German ground crews, now prisoners, but still responsible for maintenance, explained through interpreters that the fuel system could kill him in dozens of different ways. The technical briefing revealed the extent of the weapon's lethality. The Walter HWK-109-509 rocket engine burned 80% hydrogen peroxide mixed with hydrazine compounds. Contact between the two chemicals produced instantaneous combustion, generating 3,750 pounds of thrust. The same reaction that propelled the aircraft to record-breaking speeds would dissolve human tissue to bone in minutes. Ground crews wore full protective suits during fueling operations, and even minor spills required immediate flooding with water to prevent catastrophic reactions. Combat records told the final story. JG-400, the Luftwaffe's elite rocket fighter squadron, had flown fewer than 300 combat sorties during 10 months of operations. Confirmed Allied kills ranged between 9 and 16 heavy bombers. German losses exceeded 10 Comets shot down in combat, with at least 14 pilots killed in fuel-related accidents. The mathematics were inescapable. Germany's most advanced fighter aircraft was more dangerous to its own pilots than to enemy bombers. Brown studied the grim statistics as he prepared for his test flight. The fastest fighter in the world had proven itself a failure at the most basic level, keeping its pilots alive long enough to engage the enemy. The partnership began in 1937 with a handshake between two men whose combined genius would create aviation's most beautiful death trap. Alexander Lippisch, the visionary aerodynamicist from the German Research Institute for Gliding, possessed an almost mystical understanding of tailless aircraft design. His delta wing concepts had already killed enough test pilots that the Reich Air Ministry banned further development of tailless fighters in 1936. Helmuth Walter, the rocket propulsion specialist, had spent a decade perfecting engines that burned chemicals so dangerous his own technicians called them devil's venom. Lippish's design philosophy bordered on the obsessive. He approached aircraft as mathematical sculptures, believing that perfect aerodynamic form would naturally produce perfect flight characteristics. His wind tunnel models at the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt für Segelflug displayed an alien beauty, swept wings, emerging seamlessly from bullet-shaped fuselages, no vertical surfaces to disturb the airflow, control surfaces that moved in harmony rather than opposition. The shapes looked more like arrowheads than airplanes, and they flew with a grace that traditional aircraft designers couldn't understand. But grace came at a price measured in human lives. The DFS-194, Lippish's first powered tailless design, had killed Hans Zierep during high-speed taxi tests in 1938. The DFS-40 Delta claimed Günther Gronhoff during its maiden flight, spinning into the ground when the radical wing design produced handling characteristics that no pilot training could prepare for. Each accident taught Lippisch valuable lessons about tailless flight, knowledge purchased with the blood of Germany's most experienced test pilots. Walter's rocket engines represented equally dangerous innovation. His hydrogen peroxide propulsion systems generated thrust through controlled explosions that occurred hundreds of times per second inside combustion chambers located inches from the pilot's seat. The Walter RI-203 engine, designed for experimental aircraft, consumed 90% hydrogen peroxide at a rate that could drain its fuel tanks in 90 seconds. The thrust-to-weight ratio exceeded anything achievable with conventional power plants, but the fuel system required handling procedures borrowed from artillery munitions rather than aviation gasoline. The merger of Lippisch's aerodynamics with Walter's propulsion occurred when Messerschmitt absorbed both research programs in 1939. Willy Messerschmitt, already famous for the Bf-109 fighter, recognized that conventional aircraft design had reached its performance limits. Propeller-driven fighters were approaching their theoretical maximum speeds, bounded by the physics of subsonic flight. Breaking through that barrier required revolutionary thinking, and Lippisch's Delta wings combined with Walter's rockets offered the only viable path forward. The first wind tunnel tests at Messerschmitt's Augsburg facility produced results that seemed too good to believe. The Me-163 configuration generated lift coefficients that allowed takeoff at impossibly low speeds despite the aircraft's tiny wing area. Drag calculations suggested maximum speeds approaching 400 miles per hour in level flight, with diving speeds potentially exceeding 500 miles per hour. The mathematical projections indicated performance advantages over Allied fighters that bordered on science fiction. Test pilot Heini Dittmar began powered flight trials in August 1941, flying the Me-163A prototype designated V-4. The initial flights validated every prediction. The aircraft accelerated like no flying machine in history, climbing vertically at rates that turned experienced observers into believers. On October 2, 1941, Dittmar achieved 623.8 miles per hour in level flight, establishing a world speed record that would stand for 6 years. But the technical briefings concealed horrors that no performance statistics could justify. The Walter HWK 109-509 engine required 2 separate fuel systems, each presenting lethal hazards that multiplied when combined. T-Stoff, 80% hydrogen peroxide mixed with 20% water, served as the oxidizer. The chemical was so reactive that organic contamination caused spontaneous combustion. Spilled T-Stoff would dissolve wooden hangar floors, corrode metal fittings, and reduce human tissue to pink slime in minutes. C-Stoff proved equally dangerous in different ways. The fuel mixture combined hydrazine hydrate with methanol and water, creating a compound that was simultaneously toxic, corrosive, and hypergolic. Contact between T-Stoff and C-Stoff produced instantaneous ignition with explosive violence. The reaction generated temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit and pressures that could rupture steel containment systems. Fuel handlers wore full protective suits and worked with water hoses constantly ready to flood any spillage. Lippisch himself warned mechanics about the fuel's lethality during safety briefings at the Messerschmitt Flight Test Center. "If you stick your finger in T-Stoff," he told ground crews, "you get only the bone back." The chemical's appetite for organic matter was so complete that leather gloves, rubber seals, and fabric coverings dissolved on contact. Pilots wore specially treated flight suits, but even minor fuel leaks inside the cockpit could prove fatal. The propulsion system's complexity multiplied the dangers exponentially. Starting the Walter rocket required a precise sequence of valve operations that had to be performed in exactly the right order. Deviation from the checklist by even a few seconds could trigger catastrophic fuel reactions. The engine produced maximum thrust for only 7.5 minutes before exhausting its 437 gallons of fuel. Pilots had one chance to reach combat altitude, engage enemy formations, and return to base before becoming powerless gliders flying aircraft with landing characteristics that killed experienced pilots. Despite the mounting evidence of systemic danger, the Me-163 program accelerated through 1942 and 1943. Germany's strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly as Allied bombing campaigns intensified. Conventional interceptors lacked the performance necessary to catch high-altitude bomber formations operating beyond the range of escort fighters. The Comet represented Germany's only hope for regaining air superiority, regardless of its tendency to kill the pilots it was designed to save. By early 1944, production Me-163B aircraft began reaching operational squadrons despite accident rates that would have terminated any peacetime program. The revolutionary fighter that promised to change the course of aerial warfare was about to face its ultimate test against the bomber crews who had been mysteriously escaping destruction for months. Major Wolfgang Spady arrived at Brandes Airfield in May 1944 to assume command of the most dangerous assignment in the Luftwaffe. Jagdgeschwader 400, the world's first operational rocket fighter squadron, possessed 30 of the fastest interceptors ever built and a casualty rate that exceeded frontline combat units. Spate had volunteered for the position after witnessing Allied bomber formations operating with impunity over German industrial targets. Conventional fighters could no longer reach the high-altitude streams before escort fighters engaged them. The Me-163 Comet represented Germany's final hope for breaking the Allied air offensive. The tactical reality confronting JG-400 defied every principle of fighter operations developed since the Great War. Traditional interceptors could loiter at altitude, stalking bomber formations until optimal attack positions presented themselves. The Comet's 7.5-minute fuel supply eliminated such luxury. Pilots had to achieve precise interception geometry during their initial climb, execute one or two firing passes with mathematical precision, then glide home as powerless sailplanes vulnerable to any Allied fighter in the vicinity. Spate's pilots faced learning curves that killed before competency developed. The Me-163's 25-mile operational radius meant navigation errors proved fatal. Fuel miscalculations left pilots stranded at altitude with dead engines and pursuing Mustangs. Landing procedures required techniques that violated every instinct developed through conventional fighter training. The aircraft's main landing gear jettisoned automatically after takeoff, forcing pilots to belly land on retractable skids at speeds exceeding 125 miles per hour. The first operational sorties in June 1944 demonstrated both the Comet's potential and its fundamental flaws. Oberfeldwebel Siegfried Schubert achieved the squadron's initial kill on July 29th, intercepting a lone B-17 reconnaissance aircraft over Leipzig. Schubert's combat report described an engagement unlike any in aviation history. His Me-163 reached the bomber's altitude in 2 minutes 45 seconds, approaching from below at a closure rate exceeding 400 miles per hour. The firing window lasted exactly 2.5 seconds before his speed carried him beyond gun range. But Schubert's success highlighted the weapon system's impossible demands on pilot skill. He had achieved perfect interception geometry, managed his fuel consumption with mathematical precision, and delivered accurate fire during a brief moment when relative motion made gunnery almost impossible. Most pilots lacked such exceptional abilities. Failed intercepts became routine as pilots overshot targets, misjudged approach angles, or exhausted fuel before reaching combat altitude. The horrors began accumulating faster than victories. On December 30th, 1943, during training operations that preceded combat deployment, Oberleutnant Josef Puers experienced the nightmare that haunted every Comet pilot's dreams. During takeoff from Bad Zwischenahn, the jettisoned landing dolly rebounded from the ground and struck his aircraft's aft fuselage. The impact ruptured the T-Stoff fuel line, flooding the cockpit with concentrated hydrogen peroxide while Puers fought to maintain control. Ground crews reached the crash site expecting to find the usual pattern of explosion and incineration. Instead, they discovered Puers unconscious but breathing inside a cockpit that resembled a medical horror show. The leaked T-Stoff had dissolved his right arm completely, leaving only skeletal remains attached to his shoulder. His left arm and head showed advanced tissue destruction, the flesh transformed into what witnesses described as pink jelly. Puers died in the base hospital 3 days later, never regaining consciousness, his dissolution serving as a grotesque reminder of the fuel's appetite for human tissue. Similar accidents multiplied as operational tempo increased. Ground crew fatalities exceeded pilot losses during some months as fuel handling procedures broke down under combat pressure. One mechanic, known only by his nickname Schwarzer Man for the protective suit he wore during fuel operations, died instantly when he accidentally mixed T-Stoff residue with C-Stoff contamination in a cleaning bucket. Witnesses reported that his remains were spread thinly over the entire maintenance hangar, requiring complete facility decontamination before operations could resume. Test pilot Hannah Reich, Germany's most celebrated aviator and a master of propaganda appearances, suffered a career-ending accident during a demonstration flight intended to boost program morale. Her Me-163 experienced fuel system failure during landing approach, forcing a dead stick arrival that shattered 3 vertebrae and left her hospitalized for months. Even Germany's most skilled pilots could not overcome the aircraft's fundamental design flaws. Allied fighter pilots quickly adapted their tactics to exploit the Comet's operational limitations. P-51 Mustang squadrons developed hunting patterns that waited for German rocket fighters to exhaust their fuel, then pounced during the vulnerable glide phase. The Me-163's extraordinary climb performance became irrelevant once pilots were trapped in powerless sailplanes with landing characteristics that made combat maneuvering suicidal. Feldwebel's Siegfried Schubert emerged as JG-400's leading ace despite the weapon system's inherent flaws, achieving 3 confirmed bomber kills through exceptional marksmanship and tactical innovation. His success required split-second timing during firing passes that lasted mere heartbeats, threading his aircraft through defensive fire patterns while calculating deflection angles at relative speeds that made conventional gunnery techniques useless. But even Schubert's expertise could not overcome the fundamental mathematics of rocket fighter operations. The squadron's combat effectiveness peaked on November 2, 1944 during the largest Comet engagement of the war. 12 Me-163s intercepted a formation of B-17 flying fortresses near Leipzig, achieving surprise through their impossible approach speeds. The attack destroyed 2 bombers and damaged several others, representing JG-400's most successful mission. But the victory cost 4 Comets to escorting P-51s, including experienced pilots whose deaths could not be replaced. Among the casualties were Oberfeldwebel Horst Rowley, Herbert Strasnicki, Gunther Andreas, and Jacob Bollenrath, names that disappeared from squadron rosters as quickly as their aircraft had climbed toward the bomber streams. By early 1945, fuel shortages grounded most of Germany's rocket fighter fleet. Allied bombing of the T-Stoff production facility in Kiel eliminated the dangerous chemicals that made Comet operations possible. Surviving JG-400 pilots transferred to Mi-262 jet units, flying aircraft that offered revolutionary performance without the constant threat of dissolution by their own fuel systems. The arithmetic of desperation drove JG-400's final months of operations as Germany's strategic situation collapsed around the rocket fighter squadrons. By November 1944, Allied bombing campaigns had reduced German aviation fuel production to critical levels, but the specialized chemicals required for Comet operations remained available through underground factories and dispersed production facilities. Major Wolfgang Späda received orders to maximize sortie rates regardless of pilot losses, transforming his squadron into a sacrifice unit tasked with disrupting bomber formations through sheer audacity rather than tactical effectiveness. The mission briefings reflected the Reich's deteriorating position. Intelligence reports indicated that Allied heavy bomber formations were now escorted by long-range fighters capable of following the streams all the way to target areas deep inside Germany. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts possessed the range and performance necessary to engage any conventional interceptor attempting to reach the bomber formations. Only the Mi-163's extraordinary climb rate and speed advantage offered hope of breaking through the escort screens before fuel exhaustion forced disengagement. Spate's pilots understood the mathematical impossibility of their mission. Conventional fighter tactics emphasized patience, positioning, and energy management over multiple engagements. Comet pilots had one opportunity to achieve perfect interception geometry during their brief powered flight phase. Navigation errors, fuel miscalculations, or timing mistakes eliminated any chance of successful engagement. The margin for error approached zero, while the consequences of failure included death by dissolution, explosion, or simply running out of fuel while surrounded by enemy fighters. The November 2nd mission that became JG-400's greatest victory began with intelligence reports of a large B-17 formation approaching Leipzig from the northwest. 12 Mi-163s were fueled and ready for launch at Brandis Airfield, representing the largest single Comet sortie attempted since the squadron achieved operational status. Spate assigned the mission to his most experienced pilots, including Feldwebel Siegfried Schubert, who had developed tactics that maximized the brief firing opportunities available during high-speed intercepts. The launch sequence consumed 45 minutes as ground crews completed the dangerous fueling procedures required for each aircraft. T-Stoff and C-Stoff tanks were filled separately through specialized equipment that prevented accidental mixing of the hypergolic chemicals. Pilots remained outside their cockpits until the final minutes before engine start, minimizing exposure to fuel vapors that could cause unconsciousness or death even without direct contact. The elaborate safety protocols that kept pilots alive during fueling operations slowed mission preparation to rates that would have been unacceptable for conventional fighters. Weather conditions favored the intercept. Clear skies and unlimited visibility allowed ground controllers to track the approaching bomber formation visually while calculating interception vectors for the climbing comets. The B-17s were flying at 26,000 feet in standard combat box formation, protected by approximately 50 P-51 Mustangs operating at various altitudes above and alongside the bombers. Radio intelligence indicated the target was the synthetic fuel complex at Luna, Germany's largest remaining petroleum production facility. Schubert's Me-163 achieved first contact at 1447 hours, climbing through 30,000 feet with full rocket thrust. His approach from below and behind exploited the bomber formation's defensive blind spot while avoiding most of the escorting fighters. The closure rate exceeded 400 miles per hour as Schubert lined up his attack on the formation's lead elements. His first firing pass lasted 2.8 seconds, during which his four Mk-108 30mm cannons fired 68 rounds into the leading B-17 starboard wing and fuselage. The bomber fell away in flames, its right wing folding upward as structural damage overwhelmed the airframe's load-bearing capacity. Schubert's second target, a B-17 in the formation's middle element, absorbed 42 rounds during a deflection shot that required extraordinary marksmanship at the relative speeds involved. The second bomber entered a shallow dive with heavy smoke trailing from its No. 3 engine, eventually crash landing in a farmer's field 15 miles southeast of the target area. But the tactical success lasted only minutes as escorting P-51s dove on the fuel-exhausted Comets, beginning their powerless descent toward Brandis. The rocket fighters' extraordinary speed became a liability once their engines shut down, transforming them into heavy gliders with handling characteristics that made evasive maneuvering extremely hazardous. 4 Me-163s fell to Mustang gunfire during the 15-minute running battle that followed the intercept. Oberfeldwebel Horst Raleigh died when his Comet entered an unrecoverable spin after attempting to evade two P-51s that had positioned themselves above his glide path. The aircraft's tailless configuration made spin recovery impossible without engine power, and Raleigh's Me-163 impacted the ground at nearly vertical angle, approximately 12 miles from Brandis. Herbert Strasnicki's aircraft suffered catastrophic structural failure when he exceeded safe maneuvering speeds during combat, the wing-fuselage junction separating under G-forces that the revolutionary design could not withstand. Gunther Andreas and Jakob Bohlenrath died in a fuel explosion that occurred when Andreas attempted an emergency landing with residual chemicals remaining in his tank system. The T-Stoff and C-Stoff mixed during the hard landing impact, producing the characteristic orange flash that ground crews had learned to fear. Both pilots were killed instantly in an explosion that created a crater 20 feet in diameter and scattered aircraft debris across 200 yards of countryside. The kill-to-loss ratio from JG-400's most successful mission, 2 bombers destroyed versus 4 Comets lost, illustrated the fundamental failure of rocket fighter tactics. Conventional interceptors could achieve similar results while preserving experienced pilots for subsequent missions. The Me-163's revolutionary performance advantage proved meaningless when operational losses exceeded combat effectiveness by factors that made sustained operations impossible. January 1945 brought systematic destruction of Germany's remaining chemical production capacity. Allied bombing of the T-Stoff facility at Kiel eliminated the oxidizer required for Comet operations, while transportation disruptions prevented delivery of C-Stoff from surviving production sites. By February, most Me-163s remained grounded due to fuel shortages, their crews reassigned to conventional fighter units or Me-262 jets that offered revolutionary performance without requiring specialized chemicals that could dissolve their pilots. The final JG-400 combat sorties occurred in March 1945, flown by skeleton crews using hoarded fuel supplies for symbolic rather than tactical purposes. The rocket fighters that had promised to sweep Allied bombers from German skies managed fewer than 300 total combat missions during 10 months of operations, achieving confirmed kills that could be counted on 2 hands while losing pilots to accidents at rates exceeding combat casualties. Captain Eric Brown approached the Me-163B-1A designated VF-241 with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 486 different aircraft types. The morning of May 17, 1945, carried the crisp clarity that made northern Germany's spring weather ideal for test flying. But Brown's attention focused entirely on the lethal machine before him. German ground crews worked with obvious nervousness around the fueling equipment, their protective suits giving them the appearance of medical personnel handling plague victims rather than aviation technicians preparing an aircraft for flight. The former Luftwaffe mechanics explained through British interpreters that the fueling sequence required absolute precision to prevent catastrophic reactions between the hypergolic chemicals. 120 gallons of Seestoff would fill the main fuel tank directly behind Brown's seat, while 317 gallons of T-Stoff occupied wing tanks flanking the cockpit. The total fuel load of 437 gallons represented enough chemical energy to propel the aircraft to altitudes and speeds that no other fighter could achieve, but also enough explosive potential to vaporize pilot and aircraft if containment systems failed during flight. Brown studied the technical manuals with characteristic thoroughness, noting performance specifications that validated every Allied intelligence estimate. Maximum speed of 624 miles per hour at sea level. Service ceiling of 39,690 feet. Rate of climb exceeding 11,800 feet per minute. The numbers represented a quantum leap beyond any conventional fighter's capabilities, but the operational limitations told a different story. Powered flight duration of 7.5 minutes maximum. Combat radius of 25 miles. Landing approach, speed of 125 miles per hour on a retractable skid system that had killed numerous German pilots. The cockpit inspection revealed design compromises that prioritized performance over pilot survival. The seat was positioned between fuel tanks containing chemicals that could dissolve human tissue in minutes. No ejection system was provided, making escape from a damaged aircraft virtually impossible during powered flight. The instrument panel displayed fuel quantity gauges for both chemical systems, but provided no warning devices for fuel leaks that could prove instantly fatal. The aircraft represented revolutionary engineering applied to a fundamentally flawed operational concept. German test pilot testimony, obtained through interrogation of captured personnel, painted a picture of systematic design negligence disguised as technical innovation. Pilots described aircraft that demanded perfect technique during every phase of flight, with margins for error so narrow that minor procedural deviations resulted in death. The landing characteristics alone had killed more experienced pilots than enemy action, as the skid system required touchdown techniques that violated every principle of conventional aircraft handling. Brown's pre-flight inspection confirmed the captured intelligence reports about accident rates that exceeded combat losses. Scorch marks around the engine bay indicated multiple fuel fires during previous operations. Patched areas on the fuselage suggested structural repairs following hard landings that damaged the airframe. Replacement serial number plates documented aircraft rebuilt after accidents that would have written off conventional fighters. The Me-163 designated VF-241 represented one of 48 intact Comets captured by Allied forces, but was the only example considered safe enough for powered flight trials. The engine start sequence required Brown to follow procedures developed through German pilot casualties that provided gruesome lessons in chemical propulsion safety. The T-Stoff and C-Stoff systems activated separately through a precise sequence of valve operations that had to be completed within narrow time windows to prevent fuel system failures. Deviation from the established checklist could trigger spontaneous combustion, fuel tank ruptures, or cockpit flooding with corrosive chemicals. The Walter HWK 109-509 rocket motor represented the most dangerous power plant ever installed in an operational aircraft. Takeoff acceleration exceeded every aircraft Brown had previously flown, including experimental jets that were already redefining performance expectations. The Me-163 lifted off Husum's grass runway after a ground roll of less than 1,000 feet, climbing vertically at angles that made conventional fighter tactics irrelevant. Brown reached 20,000 feet in 90 seconds, 30,000 feet in 2 minutes 15 seconds, and 32,000 feet in 2 minutes 45 seconds, confirming German performance claims with mathematical precision. But the flight characteristics that made headlines revealed operational flaws that explained the weapon system's combat failures. The extraordinary climb rate was useful only for initial intercept, as maneuvering at combat speeds drained fuel reserves so rapidly that engagement windows lasted mere seconds. The aircraft's handling became increasingly difficult as fuel consumption shifted the center of gravity, requiring constant trim adjustments that distracted from combat tasks. Most critically, the fuel exhaustion that ended powered flight transformed the world's fastest fighter into a heavy glider with approach characteristics that challenged even experienced test pilots. Brown's landing approach at 125 miles per hour on the retractable belly skid demonstrated why so many German pilots had died in landing accidents. The aircraft's high wing loading and tailless configuration created sink rates that conventional techniques could not manage. Touchdown required precise speed control and perfect flare timing with no opportunity for correction if the approach became unstable. The landing represented the most dangerous phase of flight in an aircraft where every operational aspect threatened pilot survival. The post-flight engineering assessment that Brown submitted to Royal Aircraft Establishment concluded that the Me-163 represented everything wrong with German engineering philosophy during the war's final years. Revolutionary technology had been pursued without regard for pilot safety, operational practicality, or combat effectiveness. The aircraft achieved world record performance through design compromises that made routine operations more dangerous than frontline combat in conventional fighters. Allied technical intelligence teams had already concluded that captured Comet technology offered no practical applications for post-war development. The fuel system's inherent dangers made operational deployment unacceptable for democratic military forces that valued pilot lives above propaganda victories. The aircraft's brief endurance and suicidal landing characteristics eliminated any tactical advantages that speed performance might provide. Of 48 intact Me-163s captured by British and American forces, only Brown's VF-241 was ever flown under power by Allied pilots. The final irony emerged from combat effectiveness analysis conducted using German records captured at war's end. JG-400 had achieved between 9 and 16 confirmed kills during 10 months of operations, at a cost of 10 aircraft shot down and at least 14 pilots killed in fuel-related accidents. The kill-to-loss ratio of approximately 1.6 to 1 represented abysmal effectiveness for a weapon system that consumed enormous resources and Germany's most experienced pilots. Brown's professional verdict rendered the ultimate judgment on Nazi Germany's most revolutionary fighter, the most dangerous aircraft I ever flew. The assessment came from the pilot most qualified to make such determinations, having flown more aircraft types than any aviator in history. His conclusion validated what Allied intelligence had suspected, but could never prove until German defeat provided access to operational records and surviving aircraft.